In this episode, we analyze the legal context of the second millennium BC in Genesis 15. We investigate the covenant ritual where animals are divided, a common practice in suzerainty and vassalage treaties in the ancient Near East. The logic here is clear. God uses a cultural language understandable to Abram to ensure that his promise of offspring and land is irrevocable, assuming the risk of the covenant himself by passing between the pieces as a torch of fire. In the legal context of the second millennium BC, a man's word was his only asset, but a blood contract was his final destiny. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on the plains of Canaan, we must strip away our modern mentality and enter the logic of the ancient Near East. Abram was not just looking for a promise, he was seeking a legal guarantee in a world where survival depended on offspring and land ownership. Archaeology reveals that the suzerainty treaties of that time required a graphic demonstration of the consequences of breach. However, what historical records cannot explain on their own is why the sovereign of the universe, the creator of the stars that Abram was trying to count, would decide to subject himself to a human ritual. We are not facing a simple story of abstract faith, but an event of chronological precision where the master plan intertwines with the anguish of a man who sees himself as a loose end in history. Welcome to the dissection of a covenant that redefined the relationship between the divine and the earthly, the moment when eternity committed itself under the laws of time. The fundamental value of this analysis lies in the demystification of the biblical account to present it as a concrete legal and historical fact. We are not observing a simple parable about patience, but a legal document from the Middle Bronze Age. By studying chapters 15 to 17 of Genesis, the viewer will discover that Abram's faith was not based on feelings, but on an objective guarantee provided by the sovereign. Through the lens of archaeology and ancient Near Eastern vassalage treaties, we will demonstrate that the covenant between the pieces was the divine response to a human need for legal security, setting a precedent where God, in an unprecedented manner, assumes all responsibility for the fulfillment of the contract, freeing man from a burden he could never carry. We analyze Abram's anguish under the legal code of the time, evidenced in the Nutsi tablets, where a slave, Eliezer of Damascus, would be the legal heir in the absence of biological offspring. We will see how the Creator responds not with abstract words, but with a lesson in observational astronomy to expand man's limited vision. This is the core of our archaeological investigation. We will explain the ritual of cutting a covenant. In the culture of the Hittites and Amorites, the parties passed between divided animals, invoking a curse upon themselves if they failed. The crucial fact here is that only the divine presence, the torch and the furnace, passes between the pieces, revealing that the master plan depends exclusively on the sovereign's faithfulness. We will document Abram and Sarai's attempt to fulfill the promise through legal methods, but lacking divine alignment, the use of Hagar as a surrogate mother. This segment serves as evidence of human fallibility and how earthly logic often clashes with the timing of eternity. We conclude with the transition from Abram to Abraham. We will explain the significance of circumcision not only as a religious rite, but as a mark of ownership and a perpetual reminder in the flesh. The change of names and the promise of Isaac close this legal cycle, transforming a nomadic family into the central axis of the history of redemption. To understand the magnitude of the events recorded in the book of Genesis, we must move away from purely sentimental interpretations and observe the legal and archaeological structure of the ancient Near East. Around 2000 BC, life was not governed by feelings, but by contracts, lineages, and the security of offspring. In this scenario, the story of Abram is not just a tale of faith, but a legal case of eternal dimensions that challenges all human logic of the time. The historical record places us at a moment of deep crisis. According to the laws documented in the Nutsi tablets, a childless man was legally obliged to name his chief servant as heir to preserve the family estate. Abram, aware of this legal reality, presents his complaint before the sovereign. The divine response is not mere comfort, but a demonstration of observational astronomy and a promise that transcends time. His offspring would outnumber the stars. However, for a man immersed in the culture of the Amorites and Hittites, a word was not enough. A legal ratification was needed, a contractual seal that would be binding. What happens next in the Valley of History is the covenant between the pieces, an act that archaeology identifies as a vassalage treaty. Traditionally, both parties had to walk between the dead animals, invoking a death curse upon themselves if they broke the agreement. But here, the master plan of redemption introduces an unprecedented anomaly. While a deep sleep falls upon the man, it is the presence of the Lord, manifested in a torch of fire and a smoking furnace that traverses the blood path alone. This legal act defines all subsequent biblical chronology. The Creator, in his absolute sovereignty, unilaterally assumes responsibility for the fulfillment of the promise. The weight of the contract does not rest on the fragility of man, but on the immutability of God. Through this lens, we understand why subsequent human attempts, such as the legal recourse of using Hagar as a surrogate mother, a practice documented in the legal codes of Mesopotamia, resulted in conflicts that persist to this day. Earthly logic tried to hasten what only divine faithfulness could guarantee. Finally, the transition from Abram to Abraham and the institution of circumcision in chapter 17 should not be seen as mere religious rites. From the perspective of ancient law, it is the definitive signature, a mark of ownership and belonging that seals the destiny of a nation. God not only promised a land and offspring, He established a legal architecture where He is the guarantor, the executor, and the final goal. What began as the anguish of a nomad in a tent is now revealed as the central axis of a sovereign design that uses history, archaeology, and law to demonstrate that the fulfillment of the eternal plan depends solely on the one who cannot lie. History is not built on myths, but on geographical and legal realities. Abram, a man who perfectly understands the inheritance codes of his time, finds himself in a chronological dead end. The evidence is clear. The promise of a massive offspring clashes head-on with biology and the relentless passing of decades. According to the customary law of the region, the time for a biological heir is running out, and earthly logic suggests his legacy will end in the hands of a servant. It is at this point of maximum tension that the sovereign intervenes to transform a fragile hope into a legal certainty. Genesis chapter 15 is not just a comforting dialogue. It is the beginning of a divine legal formality that will leave an indelible mark on the archaeology of faith. God does not just speak, He prepares to sign a contract. What is about to happen in the darkness of that night between the pieces of the sacrificed animals challenges all known vassalage treaties of antiquity. Let us enter the logic of this blood ritual, where the sovereign design uses the cultural codes of Mesopotamia to establish a truth that transcends millennia. The fulfillment of redemption does not depend on the creature's capacity, but on the immutable nature of the one who walks alone between the pieces. We are witnessing the architecture of a commitment that defines the rest of the biblical chronology. To understand the magnitude of what occurs between chapters 15 and 17 of Genesis, we must analyze the chronology not as a simple succession of days, but as a process of legal and biological validation. The historical record shows us an arc of approximately 24 years of silent waiting. In the ancient world, where a clan's survival depended on offspring, this time is not just a delay, it is a test of endurance against the collapse of all natural logic. The divine timeline operates on a different frequency than human urgency, allowing all the creature's options to be exhausted so that only the sovereign's intervention remains as a possible explanation. Abram is not a mystic disconnected from reality. He is a man of his time, aware of Mesopotamian laws that allow for the adoption of a servant like Eliezer to secure the estate. His conflict is deeply rational. He possesses the promise, but lacks the biological mechanism to execute it. His transformation from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of multitudes, represents the change from a legal status based on personal effort to an identity defined exclusively by the Lord's decree. His faith, counted as righteousness in chapter 15, is the basis Sarai personifies the tension between the eternal promise and temporal limitation. Following the legal customs of the time, reflected in codes like Hammurabi's, she seeks a pragmatic solution through Hagar. Her proposal is not an act of malice, but an attempt to help the sovereign plan using the tools of customary law. However, the Creator's design admits no human substitutes. Her later laughter and her name change mark the transition from the sterility of human logic to the fecundity of the divine miracle. In this phase of history, God reveals himself as El Shaddai, the Almighty God. His role is that of a sovereign monarch who, in an unprecedented act of humility, assumes all the responsibilities of the covenant alone. In the culture of vassalage covenants, both parties had to walk between the divided animals, but in Genesis 15, it is only the divine fire that passes between the pieces. This establishes an eternal legal principle. The fulfillment of the redemption plan does not depend on Abraham's wavering faithfulness, but on the immutable nature of the one who signs the contract with his own holiness. The introduction of Hagar, the Egyptian servant, adds a layer of archaeological and social complexity. She represents the connection with the outside world and the consequences of trying to accelerate the divine schedule. Ishmael, although blessed by the Lord for Abraham's sake, remains a historical reminder that what is born of the flesh cannot inherit what belongs strictly to the Spirit. The chronology stops for 13 years after Ishmael's birth, a silence only broken when Abraham reaches 99 years, ensuring that the birth of the legitimate heir, Isaac, is recognized by history as a purely sovereign act. Abraham's spiritual conflict did not begin with an external enemy, but with the silence of time. In the mindset of the ancient Near East, childlessness was not just a personal tragedy, but a legal and spiritual annulment of one's own existence. Observing the stars, Abraham did not just see lights in the firmament. He faced the cognitive dissonance between a promise of cosmic magnitude and the biological reality of an aging body. The tension lies at the heart of faith. Is the sovereign limited by the laws of entropy that he himself created? Sarai's proposal to use Hagar was not an emotional outburst, but a logical application of the customary law of the time. According to legal records found in the region, a barren wife could provide a servant to her husband to ensure the continuity of the lineage. The spiritual conflict here is subtle but profound. The temptation to substitute the sovereign's method with the efficiency of human legal structures. Ishmael is born of this pragmatic solution, becoming the historical testimony that plans drawn in the sphere of the eternal cannot be forced through the impatience of the flesh. The height of the conflict is resolved in an unprecedented ceremony of vassalage. In the sovereignty treaties of the time, both contractors had to walk between the divided animals, accepting that if they failed, their fate would be like that of those pieces. However, on the plain of Mamre, it is the Lord who walks alone. This legal act redefines the spirituality of redemption. The fulfillment of the covenant does not rest on the fragile will of man, but on the immutability of the divine nature. The Lord proclaims himself as the sole guarantor, assuming upon himself the consequences of potential human failure. Finally, the change of names from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah, along with the sign of circumcision, marks the resolution of the conflict through identity. They are no longer defined by their lack, but by the mark of divine ownership in their own flesh. The Lord, revealing himself as El Shaddai, the Almighty God, demonstrates that his chronology is not governed by the logic of empires, but by his master plan of redemption. The conflict ends when human logic surrenders to the sovereignty of the one who calls things that are not as though they were. The narrative is situated at a fundamental chronological axis for the history of humanity. We are not facing a simple folk tale, but a record of legal and theological tensions in the context of the ancient Near East. After years of nomadism and promises without a biological heir, Abram faces a succession crisis. In the culture of the time, as evidenced by tablets found in sites like Nutsi, a servant could be adopted as heir in the absence of children. However, the sovereign intervenes to elevate human logic toward a superior design, leading the patriarch out of his tent to contemplate the vastness of the cosmos as a metaphor for his future offspring. Chapter 15 describes a legal formality known as the Covenant of Pieces. In Syrian Mesopotamian vassalage treaties, the subordinate passed between the dead animals, accepting for himself the same fate if he violated the terms of the agreement. But on the plain of Mamre, a historical and theological anomaly occurs. Abram falls into a deep sleep, a state of absolute incapacity, and it is the Lord, represented by a pillar of smoke and a torch of fire, who traverses the blood corridor alone. This act communicates an inescapable logical truth. The guarantee of the covenant's fulfillment lies not in the faithfulness of man, but in the immutability of the divine nature. The Creator makes himself the sole responsible party for the destiny of the promise. The chronology moves toward a phase of human pragmatism. Faced with the silence of the years, Sarai resorts to the customary law of her time, using her servant Hagar to obtain offspring. The birth of Ishmael is not a divine calculation error, but the result of trying to force eternity into the limits of carnal impatience. This event introduces a 13-year period of apparent silence, a time where faith is tested by the biological reality of aging, until the sovereign manifests himself again not just as the Lord, but as El Shaddai, the Almighty God who sustains all existence. The resolution of this chronological phase occurs in chapter 17 with the redefinition of identity. The change of names from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah is not mere linguistic formalism, but a transfer of ownership. By adding the sound of the He, the divine breath of life, to their names, the Lord marks their lives with His own essence. The institution of circumcision acts as the seal of the covenant in the flesh, a permanent physical sign that this lineage does not belong to the logic of the world's empires, but to the master plan of redemption. The historical and theological evidence of this period leads us to an inescapable logical conclusion. The structure of our existence is not sustained on the basis of our faithfulness, but on the immutability of the divine character. In the context of the ancient Near Eastern covenants, the passing of only one party between the pieces of the sacrificed animals was a legal anomaly. By the Lord assuming total responsibility for the promise, He established a principle of security that nullifies the anxiety of human effort. The reflection here is technical and deep. The validity of the plan does not fluctuate according to the performance of men, but rests on the sovereign decree of the Creator. When we analyze the episode of Hagar and Ishmael, we observe the universal conflict between pragmatic logic and providential patience. History teaches us that the attempt to help the sovereign through human solutions, though legally acceptable in their time, only introduces distortions into the calendar of redemption. The 13-year wait of silence was not abandonment, but a pedagogical preparation. The practical learning for Abraham and for us is that autonomy is the greatest obstacle to experiencing the power of El Shaddai. God does not need our biological or strategic capacity. He requires our surrender to the original design of the master plan. Finally, the redefinition of identity through the change of names and the sign of circumcision acts as a seal of ownership. It is not an aesthetic formalism, it is an ontological mark. By adding the essence of His own name to the identities of Abraham and Sarah, the Lord teaches us that entering His covenant implies a radical transformation of who we are. Circumcision, as physical evidence, daily reminded the patriarch that his lineage was not a product of nature, but of grace. The final lesson is clear. True stability is found in ceasing to attempt to write our own history, to allow the sovereign to inscribe us into His eternal chronology. Historical evidence demonstrates that in the ancient Near East, a covenant was not a simple gentleman's agreement. It was a binding legal structure that defined survival. When we observe the record of Genesis, we notice that Abraham's anxiety over the lack of an heir was not just an emotional desire, but a crisis of legal legitimacy according to the customs of the time. However, the sovereign does not respond with a bureaucratic solution, but with an intervention that alters the logic of human causality. As the theophanies of the smoking furnace and the burning torch pass between the pieces of the sacrifice, the Creator establishes an absolute guarantee. The execution of the master plan is His exclusive responsibility. This action of connection between the eternal decree and human fragility becomes tangible in the redefinition of identity. The linguistic analysis of the name change from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah reveals the insertion of a particle of the divine name into their own identities. It is not an aesthetic formalism. It is a mark of ontological ownership. The archaeology of Abraham's soul shows us that the human attempt to speed up the process through Hagar was a strategic miscalculation, a deviation that could not nullify the original design. The 13-year silence between Ishmael and the new revelation of El Shaddai was not a chronological void, but a space of preparation so that faith would cease to lean on biology and rest totally on divine sovereignty. Finally, the sign of circumcision acts as the physical seal of this connection. In the context of redemption, this mark permanently reminded the patriarch that his lineage was not a product of natural effort, but a fruit of the promise. The technical lesson is profound. To be partakers of the Lord's chronology, we must allow Him to rewrite our nature. The connection is completed when we understand that our stability does not come from our ability to fulfill contracts, but from being inscribed in a covenant where the Sovereign has pledged His own glory to ensure our future. The design follows a logical, immutable, and perfectly coordinated course from eternity to the practical reality of our lives. The analysis of the history of redemption forces us to observe the facts not just as stories of faith, but as sovereign legal interventions in time. In the mindset of the ancient Near East, a promise without a legal seal lacked pragmatic validity. Abraham, operating under the logic of his context, sought technical security for his offspring. However, what occurs between chapter 15 and 17 of Genesis is a radical transformation of the structure of contract law. The sovereign does not simply sign an agreement, he constitutes himself as the sole guarantor of fulfillment. Observing the ritual of the pieces, biblical archaeology reveals a fundamental anomaly. In a typical sovereignty treaty, both parties had to walk between the animals as a sign that if they failed, they would suffer the same fate as the beasts. Nevertheless, in this strategic design, only the Lord's presence, represented by fire and the pillar of smoke, traverses the blood path. This is the synthesis of grace. The responsibility for the master plan rests entirely on the immutable faithfulness of the Creator. Man is the beneficiary of a covenant that he himself does not have the capacity to sustain by his own merits. The transition toward personal transformation was interrupted by the strategic miscalculation in the Hagar episode. From a historical perspective, Abraham's attempt to obtain an heir through human biological means was an attempt to force the divine chronology through the legal customs of the time. But the 13-year silence that followed Ishmael's birth was not an absence of purpose, but a period of ontological preparation. The Lord's logic is clear. For the promise to be evident, human capacity must be recognized as insufficient. The transformation culminates in an act of identity redefinition. The change of names is not a semantic formalism, but an insertion of the sovereign's nature into the very essence of the man and woman. By adding a particle of his own name to theirs, the Lord establishes a mark of ownership and a new historical direction. Abraham ceases to be an exalted father in local terms to become the father of multitudes within the eternal chronology. The master plan is no longer an external idea. It is encoded in the patriarch's identity. Ancient inscription, which then fades into the image of an countless offspring walking toward the future under the light of divine sovereignty. Finally, the sign of circumcision is established as the physical seal that closes this cycle of synthesis. In the context of the archaeology of the soul, This act represented the definitive cut with trust in the flesh and the beginning of a life dependent on the promise. The lesson for history is absolute. The sovereign's design transcends biology and human bureaucracy. At the end of this process, Abraham not only has a promise, but a new nature and an unbreakable covenant that guarantees that through his lineage, the redemption of the world will follow its logical and predetermined course from eternity. The logic of redemption does not rest on abstract feelings, but on legal and sovereign commitments that defy the erosion of time. In the culture of the ancient Near East, a covenant was not ratified with a signature, but with a blood ritual. What the historical records of Genesis 15 present to us is a covenant of self-malediction. By dividing the animals, the contractors established a death clause. May the same be done to me as to these animals, if I do not keep my word. It is crude evidence of the seriousness of the divine design. This is where human chronology surrenders to the master plan. Under the laws of the time, both parties had to walk between the animals. However, in this foundational act, the sovereign traverses the blood path in absolute solitude. It is a unilateral act of overwhelming logic. The Creator assumes all responsibility for fulfillment. He commits himself to suffering the consequences of the covenant's breach, even when the fault is committed by man. It is not a formalism, it is the legal architecture of grace. This event on the plains of Canaan is the blueprint that prefigures the culminating moment of universal history. Centuries later, when Abraham's offspring demonstrated their biological and moral incapacity to uphold the holiness of the covenant, the sovereign executed the clause he himself had signed between the pieces. On the cross, Christ becomes the substitutionary sacrifice that validates the eternal commitment. The blood shed at Calvary is the logical and legal conclusion of that starry night. It is the Lord fulfilling his own sentence to preserve his promise. The covenant between the pieces is not an archaeological vestige, but the guarantee that the Creator's purpose is unalterable. The master plan does not depend on the fragility of human effort, but on the unwavering faithfulness of the sovereign. At the end of this historical sequence, we understand that circumcision and the name change were external seals of an internal reality. The destiny of humanity was sealed by the one who, passing between the swore by himself that redemption would be a historical and eternal certainty. Archaeological evidence teaches us that in the ancient Near East, a contract was not just a signature, but a right of life or death. The practical challenge that arises from Genesis chapters 15 to 17 is not an invitation to blind emotion, but to a rigorous analysis of faithfulness. We must confront the logic of the master plan. While Abram tried to resolve the promise through human strategies, such as his union with Hagar to father Ishmael, the sovereign operated in a dimension of eternal legal validity. The human error in chapter 16 is the historical reminder that any attempt to help the Creator outside of his terms only generates chronological conflict. The challenge that this historical record imposes on us is the surrender of personal sovereignty before divine sovereignty. In chapter 17, the name change and the sign of circumcision were not arbitrary acts. In the context of ancient diplomacy, changing a vassal's name was an act of absolute takeover. Abram, the exalted father, becomes Abraham, father of multitudes, not because of his biological capacity, which was exhausted, but by a judicial decree from the celestial throne. Circumcision functioned as a physical seal of a covenant that had already been ratified with blood. For the contemporary observer, the question is logical. In what does our security rest? The master plan reveals that the fulfillment of redemption does not depend on man's perfection, but on the immutability of the Lord's character. The covenant between the pieces guarantees that even when we fail, like Abraham doubting or trying to force fulfillment through Ishmael, the sovereign remains faithful to his own signature. History is not a chaos of random events, but a legally structured progression toward final redemption. This is the challenge, to align our lives with the certainty that the sovereign has already walked between the pieces for us. The archaeology of faith tells us the foundation is solid. The covenant is unilateral in its fulfillment, but total in its demands for loyalty. To recognize this is to understand that our personal history only makes sense when inserted into the divine schedule. The promise is a historical fact. Redemption is a legal conclusion, and the master plan is, by definition, infallible. The story of Abraham is not an isolated legend. It is a legal and archaeological record that redefines our understanding of loyalty and sovereignty. By analyzing Genesis chapters 15 to 17, we are not simply observing a man on a spiritual quest, but the sovereign establishing an immovable chronology for human redemption. In the context of ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, blood covenants represented the highest possible legal commitment. However, the master plan introduced an unprecedented variable. It was the Lord who, in an act of legal condescension, walked alone between the pieces, assuming upon himself the responsibility for fulfillment. This analysis leads us to a logical conclusion. If the covenant was ratified with such historical precision and legal rigor, our contemporary security cannot be based on our emotional fluctuations, but on the immutability of the one who signs the decree. Abraham's name change and the sign of circumcision were not mere rituals. They were acts of absolute takeover by the Creator. The historical record is compelling. The Lord does not improvise. Every event, from the promise of the heir to the change of identity of the patriarchs, is a link in a chain of divine custody that guarantees the success of the master plan. We invite you to consider this evidence. How does your perspective transform when you understand that your existence is not a random event, but is anchored in a covenant legally ratified in eternity? We encourage you to delve into these records and share your reflections with this community of rational and grounded faith. The archaeology of the Word demonstrates that the foundation is solid and that the divine schedule follows its undefeated course. The covenant between the pieces is the guarantee that the sovereign will fulfill to the last detail what his mouth has spoken. The record of Genesis, analyzed with the rigor of history and legal archaeology, does not present us with a simple narrative of faith, but the documentation of an irrevocable contract under the standards of the ancient Near East. The evidence is overwhelming. The master plan of redemption was not an improvised response to the human fragility of Abraham and Sarah, but a sovereign decree established with absolute chronological precision. By passing alone between the pieces of the sacrificed animals, the Lord not only validated a promise, but legally assumed the cost of fulfillment, guaranteeing that the success of the covenant did not depend on man's inconstancy, but on the immutability of his own essence. This reality transforms our understanding of the present. The identity change from Abram to Abraham, sealed by the sign of circumcision, was not a mere cultural rite, but an act of legal takeover by the Creator over His people. If the historical record demonstrates that the Sovereign has fulfilled every clause of this millennial contract, then our position today is not anchored in our emotions, but in the legal structure of the Word of God. The divine schedule follows its undefeated course, and the covenant between the pieces is the archaeological and theological evidence that what the Lord has decreed, His hand will execute with total accuracy. We invite you to reflect on this solid foundation. How does your perception of history change, knowing that every event is subordinate to a plan legally ratified in eternity? Continue exploring with us the records of the Bible through the lens of logic and historical evidence. The foundation is immovable, and the Sovereign's narrative is the only one that grants a rational purpose to our existence. The covenant remains in effect. The design follows its course.